All right, so I wanted to talk about what constitutes good tone, and I guess the first thing that you want to talk about is like what exactly is good tone. So, then one of the things that when we start talking about guitar tones, everybody has a different vocabulary, and to me, there's so many differences in terms of different styles of jazz guitar that the tone of Charlie Christian is very different than the tone of Bill Frisell and everybody in between, from George Benson to Joe Pass. For me, when I think of a good tone, the word I think about is like a brown tone. Some people might say creamy. Some people might say warm, rich. Those are all subjective words that are used to convey what we're hearing. But for me, that means minimal effect in the traditional jazz idiom, not the stuff that I've been trying out in terms of all the different pedals and things of that nature. But in any event, though, I think there are a couple of things that you have to talk about when you talk about good jazz tone. You have to talk about fingers, and this is in the order to me about priorities: fingers, picks, strings, amps, and guitars. Amps and guitars are probably the last two things you want to talk about because there's so many. We all have different guitars, have different amps, and this video would be so long if we talked about amp settings and different types of guitars. And one of the things I've been fortunate in is that I've tried a lot of guitars, and I think my tone sounds pretty similar across multiple guitars. And the one thing that's always constant is I'm the same player. My fingers are at work. So that to me is the predominant things. But there are still some tips that you can talk about or I can give that'll help you just in terms of trying to get as clear of a tone and note possibility as note sound as possible. The first thing is you got to realize to me you have two hands, and both of them are very different in terms of the way you think about it from that perspective. So the left hand, to me, the most important thing is the placement of your fingers relative to the fretboard. The closer you are to the fret when you're fretting a note, the clearer your tone's going to be, the better, more precise it's going to be, and the richer it's going to be, regardless of how you define that. So in other words, if I'm playing this A, see how close that is to the fret versus I'm not in the middle, I'm not right here, I'm right here, right bumping up against the fret. And you notice I try to do this whether I'm hitting a chord or a single line. So always think about that. Again, it becomes subconscious, but if you watch a really good player, they will have that precision and they'll be really snugly up against the fret. So be very cognizant of your left hand. And folks who play classical guitar, study, they sort of kind of get this because there's no amplification to help you out with. So that's what's going on with the left hand. Make sure you're as close to the fret as possible. And this is something that was kind of honed on to me as I'm trying to learn the cello. You don't have a frets, you have a fingerboard. So to get the right intervals, you got to be like almost on the line without being on the line, which is the frets that don't exist on a cello. So that's what's going on with the left hand. The right hand, and this is whether you use picks or not, you want to me, I try to get as close to the fretboard as possible. This gets me the warmest tone. I don't play down here unless the music calls for it, or I just want to vary something that I'm going to be playing over and over again. So versus like where it's a thinner sound, it's not as warm. It's a good sound, and you vary that sound. So the placement of your right hand, if you're playing fingerstyle or pick, is very, very important. And for me personally, I think you get a warmer jazz tone the closer you are to the fretboard. Very, very intuitive. The next thing, so you got your fingers and you got your pick. The same concept works for your pick. So if I'm doing a line, I'm going. So I was over here, which is almost at the bridge pickup here. But if I go, a tad bit warmer the closer you get out there, and you don't want that to mud. So So that's the other thing. So you got your fingers closer on your left hand to the actual fret. Then you've got your picking hand or your pick. You don't have to be as close on it, but I like to think that you should try to probably stay somewhere on the pickup or somewhere in the middle. Definitely not here unless you're just trying to vary the tone. You're not going to get that quintessential, at least how I'm defining quintessential jazz tone. The other thing about pick is the pick gauge. I'm using a TAD 60 or I'm using a D'Andrea. They're both about 1.5 millimeter or higher, and I've got one, a Kaysen pick that's even higher than that. I believe that the thicker your picks, the fatter your sound's going to be. That's just the way what my ears tell me. So you got your fingers, you've got picks, and the third one, and I've done some videos on that, is strings. People will argue that the quintessential jazz sound is flat wounds, but if you think about it, when Charlie Christian was playing, he wasn't playing flat wounds. The thing was very, very nice and rich, but it was round wounds that he was using. So when you think about strings, I think that's a personal choice. You can get a fat, warm tone out of both flat wounds and round wounds. My preference still is primarily flat wounds, but ironically enough, this is still strong with round wounds. Where I do probably adhere to is heavier gauge. Yes, you can play guitar with light 10 strings. I believe when I say heavier gauge, you need to have at least, or I need to have at least 11s on, in some cases 13s or 14. And it's a misconception both ways to think that the heavier the string that you have, the warmer you're going to be, or the lighter it is, it's not going to be, or it's going to be harder, I should say, if you have heavy strings. It's not harder to play a guitar if you have heavy strings on, if you set it up right. If it's set up properly, you can play 13s and fly off the neck if need be. But I do think that at least 11s, whether they're round wounds or flat wounds, are sort of needed, at least for the style of playing that I'm using. So you got fingers, picks, and strings. And the thing I want to talk about amps is that I could be here all day talking about whether or not to use a tube amp or something like the Henriksen, which is a solid state amp. The one tip I want to add is, being that we all have different amps and so different sets of EQs, I'm one of those people, set it and leave it. Get your amps off the floor. I don't think I've ever said this, but it's really important to me. I played for years with amps on the floor, and what happens is that the bass and the mid-range gets sucked into the ground, whereas if you have it on a chair or on an amp stand or just elevated, I find I get a better, richer and sound from that perspective. So that to me is very, very important. And as far as like setting, I'm really into guitars. I should say amps have to have a really good mid-range. The last thing I want to talk about is the guitars itself. You can play jazz off of anything, but the preferred choice is at least a humbucker. But I play with tellies, with lipstick pickups and things of that nature. And, you know, they're all over the place. I think, again, you know, you can get a great tone out of any guitar if you practice, and practice some more. So there you have it. A really long video, but I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit for me, what I've learned over the years, what constitutes a jazz tone in the order of preference that I think is the important: fingers, picks, strings, amp, and last but not least is the guitar that you're playing. And you can play jazz off of anything. Thank you again.